Hey, thrilling suspense fanatics, your eager ears await the thrilling conclusion of The City of Madness by Charles R. Saunders, starring his Conan-esque hero Imaro. Check the link in the description box below to listen to the first part if you haven't already. And if you have, let's go. The City of Madness by Charles R. Saunders. Part 4, The Broken City. In the white glare of moonlight, the dark city brooded like some vast behemoth of the night. But the two figures stealthily approaching its portal had seen how the city looked in full daylight. They knew that it was nothing more than a dead ruin, inhabited by the remnants of a dying people. Imaro and Pomphis had seen the cracked walls and the broken pylons of Atlantean architecture. Also, they had seen Bomunu, or at least what was left of him. Never would Imaro gain the vengeance he had sought against the traitor. Bomunu's headless corpse hung impaled upon an iron spike, the gory pointed end of which protruded through his neck as a macabre replacement for his absent head. Torture had so mutilated the body that only the embossed Zangian belt told Imaro that this bloody thing had indeed once been Bomunu. As to his missing head, the pair uneasily recalled the painted skulls that hung from the waists of the Mzungu warriors. Imaro was reasonably certain that Tanisha was alive inside the decaying city. From what he knew of Mzungu culture, Pomphis agreed. As the two laid plans for slipping into the city, Pomphis wondered at the ever-changing moods of his tall companion. Had he been the raving wild man of earlier that day, Imaro might have attempted to storm the ruined city single-handed. Now the Bambuti was mildly surprised by the Ilyasai's level-headed suggestions. He could see how this man could have welded together a collection of cutthroats and thieves into a formidable army of brigands. The lone guard at the crumbling wall was not diligent. His duties were only of token significance, since the beasts shunned his city and his people did not fear other men. Shifting to a more comfortable position, he longed to join in the rites that were now commencing. Decades had passed since black men had last set foot in the Atlanteans' hidden domain. Of those who had been captured today, the man hung impaled outside the gate, and the woman was part of the ceremony inside. So engrossed were the Mzungus in their rituals that they were not curious about 3 soldiers who had failed to return. A sudden sound behind him woke the guard from his reverie. Whirling, he attempted to draw his sword, but his reaction was too slow and too late. A brawny forearm clamped like an iron bar across his throat. Steely fingers held his sword arm immobile. The guard was a big man, but for all his violent struggles, he was held like a child in the relentless grasp of his unseen assailant. As the massive forearm crushed his windpipe, the guard tried to shriek a warning, but the only sound he could make was a gurgle. Before death blackened his vision, the Mzungu dimly discerned a man the size of a child grinning up at him, teeth flashing whitely in the moonlight. Because the guard was almost as large as Imaro, his armor and the helmet fit the barbarian tightly, but adequately. Thus disguised, he strode swiftly down the weed-choked street of the city, following the drum beats and the sound of weird chanting. Beside him, Pomphis slipped like a wraith between the grotesque shadows cast by broken buildings. Imaro was careful to keep his eyes from lingering overlong upon the sculptures and inscriptions lining the rotting walls, lest they ensorcel his mind. Imaro and Pomphis were drawn down the ancient avenue to the source from which the strange sounds came. It was a cube-shaped edifice in better condition than the rest of the city's buildings. In fact, it looked completely untouched by the breath of time. Like a guardian of the destiny of its people, the titanic structure squatted in the center of the ruined city. As they padded noiselessly up the steps to the yawning entrance to the mysterious edifice, the two observed it was windowless, and its granite face was covered with intricate bas-reliefs depicting scenes of unspeakable and obscene cruelty. Imaro ground his teeth at the thought of the suffering of the unfortunates who must have been dragged screaming into this malignant temple when the City of Madness was first built. Pomphis sadly reflected that the Mzungus had not forsworn the sins of their ancestors. They saw that the entrance was guarded by nothing other than the pair of sculptured stone serpent things whose long necks formed a forbidding archway. They peered down a long dark hall cut out of solid stone and saw at its end a square of lurid, unsteady light. This light, then, was their destination. Like hunting panthers, Imaro and Pomphis stalked toward it. Part 5. Horror Enthroned. Concealed by wavering shadows, Pomphis and Imaro stared at what must have been the entire population of the ruined city participating in a ceremony of ominous splendor. The celebrants were men, and they were naked except for the ever-present black skulls dangling upon their loins. To the rhythmic beat of drums, the Mzungus capered and cavorted in peculiar fashion, shouting and screaming in meaningless words. Though they may once have been a comely race, now the Mzungus bore the marks of advanced dissipation. Loose, rattled flesh swayed and jiggled on their bodies. All of them wore loose-lipped, intoxicated expressions on their pale faces, as though they had been inhaling the fumes of the swamp lotus. The attention of Imaro and Pomphis was held not by the orgiastic throng, but on that which lay at the center of the temple chamber. A colossal throne sat behind a high altar. Upon the throne hunkered an image of revolting ugliness. Carved from pitted, unidentifiable gray-green rock, it was a statue of one of the most loathsome of the Mashatan, an Azuth. At first it looked like some monstrous kind of ape. From the waist up, the Azuth was indeed gorilloid in aspect, though its wide mouth sprouted tusks that would have been envied even by Nunda the Saber-tooth. But from the waist down it had the legs of a goat, with sharp, lethal hooves in place of feet. Creations of the Mashatan, Azuths had menaced mankind aeons ago until Thutanas, a scientist of Kush, bred the famous black lions, which were more than a match for the Azuths. Supposedly, the ape things had been driven from Kush long ago, but even though the thing on the throne was only a stone image, it seemed to be leering with empty eyes at the altar before it. Upon the polished altar lay Tanisha, arms and legs bound in a spread-eagle position. Her nude black body was an aesthetic contrast to the Mzungus. She had lush feminine proportions, and an attractive face framed by a circle of kinky black hair. The firm dark globes of her breast thrust as she breathed in labored gasps. Her frantic brown eyes darted about as her ordeal approached its climax. Hopelessly twisting her supple body from side to side, Tanisha awaited her doom. Leaping and prancing around Tanisha's altar was the high priest of the Azuth. He looked no different than his fellow Mzungus, save that he was taller and had 8 black painted skulls encircling his flabby waist, and a freshly painted one cradled in both gnarled hands. Suddenly the priest dropped to his bony knees. Waving the black skull in a slow circle, he began to harangue the stone image of the Azuth, invoking names whose alien syllables made Imaro's skin crawl in disgust. Sensing that the time had come to put their plan into action, Imaro poked Pomphis with an impatient elbow. As if propelled from a catapult, Pomphis hurtled into the torchlit chamber. In a voice loud and deep, the pygmy bellowed imprecations in the same guttural tongue that the Mzungus were using. The effects of Pomphis' speech were instantaneous and remarkable. Ceasing their awkward gyrations, the entire assemblage of Atlanteans stood stock still and goggle-eyed for a long, frozen moment. Then they broke into an hysterical frenzy, shrieking in inchoate rage. Froth flying from their distended mouths, the Mzungus looked wildly about, seeking the utterer of blasphemy. With a wicked grin on his childlike face, Pomphis repeated the inflammatory phrase in even louder tones. Now he caught the eye of the Mzungus. As one, they rushed the bambuti, despite the imprecations of their priest. Pomphis turned on his heel and fled down the dark corridor, showing a speed that was not surprising considering the circumstances. Imaro flattened himself against the wall. Just as Pomphis had predicted, between the blending of Imaro's skin into the darkness and the Mzungu's single-minded, murderous pursuit, the screaming mob rushed by without noticing him. He waited until the last footsteps had faded out of the temple. Then the massive Ilyasai entered the chamber. Part 6. When Horror Walks. The priest lifted his head at this new intrusion. He stared in incredulity. Despite the Atlantean armor he was wearing, the giant's arms and legs were too black to belong to one of his people. Tanisha, bound to the Azeth's altar, failed to recognize Imaro. Knowing that he had no chance against the black giant, the cunning priest had only one chance to complete the ceremony. He had mere seconds to do so. With lightning speed, the priest heaved the fresh black skull directly at the squatting statue of the Azeth, which produced singular results. For the skull literally exploded on contact with the stone surface of the Azeth, splintered bits flying in all directions. This stopped Imaro in his tracks. As he stared in disbelief, a filmy substance began to emerge from the shattered remnants of the black skull. The smoky, translucent substance eerily coalesced into an unstable human figure with flaming slits of eyes that glared directly into those of Imaro. Gradually, inexorably, the ghost thing began to merge with the stone image of the Azeth. And as the shadow substance was absorbed into the idol, a horrible transmutation took place. The gray-green stone was becoming living, breathing flesh. In a flash, Imaro understood. Nameless terrors began to claw insistently at him, threatening to unman the mighty warrior. Only to one person could this fresh new skull belong. To only one man could Imaro attribute the malevolent eyes of the smoky wraith thing. The vague, misty figure, now completely absorbed into the statue of the Azeth, could only be the Nka, the death spirit of his foe, Bomunu. The priest had freed Bomunu's Nka from its spell-made prison, and the fury of the lost soul that now animated the living Azeth was directed at Imaro. Knots of rock-hard muscle writhed across the arms and shoulders of the Azeth that was Bomunu. It moved on the granite throne. It opened its saber-filled mouth and roared. The chilling sound of that cry reverberated through the chamber. With iron determination, Imaro beat back his rising fear. If this monstrous thing was indeed Bomunu, then at least now he knew what he was fighting. And what he felt for Bomunu was far from fear. As for Tanisha, she stared in horror at these happenings, her incomparable body slick with cold sweat. She swooned. Imaro leapt into action as the Azoth bounded from its throne and landed with a clatter of hooves upon the stone floor. Bellowing the war cry of the Ilyasai, he moved in to close with his demonic adversary. A hideous grin split the ape-like visage of the monstrosity as it leapt towards the barbarian. Surprisingly agile despite the 7-foot bulk of its misshaped body, its eyes glowed with an intelligence that had never belonged to any beast but man. They were the eyes of Bomunu. Imaro swung his scimitar at the Azoth's belly in a disemboweling thrust. It never reached its target. With incredible speed, the monster lashed out with one hoof and sent Imaro's sword spinning across the floor. The second kick thudded into the warrior's side. A lesser man's ribs would have been caved in at the impact. The Azoth's third blow was halted in midair by Imaro's cobra-quick hand. Firmly gripping the thin goat ankle, Imaro kicked its other leg from under it. This caused the Azoth to crash heavily to the stone floor. Imaro leapt astride the fallen monster and brought his mallet-like fist down twice, smashing at its gaping mouth. The fist did its work well. The Azoth's formidable fangs broke. Screeching in pain, the Azoth struck back. One sweep of its immense arm sent Imaro flying through the air to land in a tumbled heap 10 feet away. Scrambling upright, the combatants faced each other anew, each now having more respect for the other. Imaro knew that he would need his dagger against this formidable opponent. The Azoth was too strong for even him to fight bare-handed. He reached down to draw his dagger. The scabbard was empty. Too late, Imaro recalled that he had given it to Pomphis to use in case the Mzungus caught up with him. The Azoth, sensing the barbarian's momentary lapse of concentration, clattered across the intervening space and encircled Imaro's body in a deadly bear hug. Its long, powerful arms began to squeeze with crushing force. Imaro struggled furiously, but was unable to break the iron grip that pinioned his arms to his sides. Harder squeezed the Azoth, all the while glaring at Imaro with the triumphant eyes of Bomunu. Still did Imaro strive to break free. If only he could free his arms before the beast crushed the breath out of his body. He was thankful for the protection of the armor, even though it was made by the accursed Mzungus. Suddenly, the Azoth realized that Imaro was slipping loose. Carrying the big barbarian as though he were weightless, the monster slammed Imaro into the nearest wall. The impact nearly tore Imaro loose from his senses. Pain exploded through his skull, yet he doggedly fought on, levering his arms upward against the Azoth's body. Again and again Imaro was pounded viciously against the unyielding granite wall. Only the metal helmet on his head prevented his skull from being split open. Then the helmet fell away. Blackness crept along the edges of Imaro's consciousness. He knew that he couldn't take much more punishment. He had to break free. With a supreme effort, dipping deep into the well of his barbarian-bred vitality, his arms slid out of the hold of the Azoth's grip. His fists clubbed against the sides of the beast's bullet head, landing directly on its ears. With a howl of pain, the Azoth fell back. In a reflex action, Imaro shoved out with both feet as he slid to the floor. Dimly, he heard it tumble backwards and fall a dozen feet away. Then he painfully dragged himself to his feet. Imaro's head was spinning, and his body throbbed in agony and exhaustion, but he still lived, and he could still fight. Already the Azoth was approaching again, but more slowly this time. Though blood was dripping from its ears and broken mouth, Imaro knew that his own pain was greater than the monster's. But he knew also that the Azoth's seemingly invincible body housed the Nka of Bomunu, and in Bomunu's eyes he now detected a glimmer of fear. At once a stratagem flashed into Imaro's mind. "Bomunu!" Imaro's deep voice rang out. The Azoth stopped short at the sound of its true name. "Bomunu!" he repeated. "Traitor! Coward! Even in the skin of a demon beast you cannot hope to best me, you who sold the lives of 5,000 men for a handful of diamonds, miserable woman-stealer! Were you in the body of Varinga, the swamp dragon, still would I sweep the floor with your useless carcass. Come, let us see if you dare to match strength again with a man." Imaro's challenge had its desired effect. Knowing that the Azoth was too powerful to meet in head-on combat, Imaro had shrewdly goaded the part of it that was Bomunu. Now enraged by Imaro's taunts, the Azoth bellowed like an enraged beast, lowered its head, and charged as though it meant to immolate Imaro in one mad rush. At the last possible moment, however, Imaro ducked under one of the outstretched arms and grabbed its thick wrist. Pivoting on his heel, he let the Azoth's own momentum carry it thrashing into the wall. The Azoth staggered slowly to its impossibly hooved feet, but before it could move, Imaro was upon it like a springing panther. Leaping astride the Azoth's broad back, he locked powerful legs around its sagging middle. Then he cupped his hands under the chin of the monster and pulled back with all his might. Harder and harder he pulled, seeking to break the creature's neck. At the same time, the Azoth reached back with its long arms and tried to rip him off his body. But the grip of Imaro's legs was vice-like, and Imaro's arms were pulling his head back farther and farther. Cords of muscle swelled and rippled across Imaro's back and shoulders as he applied yet more force. Once he had twisted the neck of Umboa the buffalo. The Azoth's neck was no thicker than Umboa's. Now the part of the monster that was Bomunu grew desperate with fear. More pressure was being exerted by the tormentor astride its back. Already the neck bones were beginning to crack audibly. A strangled cry issued from the Azoth's tortured throat. It was the scream of a frightened, dying thing. One last surge of almost superhuman strength, and the Azoth's neck broke with the sound of a tree snapping. Even as it toppled forward, Imaro could feel the slimy flesh turning back to stone. Having died a second time, the Nka of Bomunu had now gone to the death hell of the Mashatan. Imaro staggered aside as the Azoth crashed to the floor. The god of the Mzungus was now nothing more than a pile of broken rock. Imaro tried to maintain consciousness and rise to his feet, but the battles he had fought that day, the long miles he had traveled, the tremendous effort of the fight with the Azoth, all these exertions had been enough to sap even Imaro's mighty thews. He sprawled upon the floor, breathing in broken pants and gasps. No time did he have to savor his triumph, his final revenge against Bomunu. Sensing a presence behind him, Imaro painfully managed to turn his aching head. What he saw was the priest of the Mzungus standing over him. On the priest's pale face was an expression of total and insane hatred, and in his hands was Imaro's lost scimitar. Part 7. The Ghost Herd. High over his lank-haired head did the Mzungu lift the sword to bring it down in a death stroke for this black interloper who had dared to profane his temple and slay his god. Imaro's reflexes were sluggish with fatigue. Still he attempted to avoid the priest's blow. Suddenly the Mzungu cried out, more in surprise than pain. His eyes bulged, and Imaro's sword dropped from his nerveless fingers. Stiffly, the priest fell forward, dead without knowing it. From his back protruded the hilt of a deep-driven dagger, and behind the corpse stood none other than Pomphis. For once the pygmy was not grinning. Apprehension marked his features as he assisted Imaro to his feet. Pomphis spoke hurriedly. "Haven't you cut that wench free yet, man?" he demanded peevishly. "We've got to get out of here before that raving mob returns." Then, noticing the barbarian's battered condition, Pomphis asked, "What in the name of Matungi happened to you?" Too exhausted to speak, Imaro pointed to the empty throne, then to the fragmented remains of the Azoth. Understanding dawned immediately in the Bambuti's eyes. Thanks to his Cushite mentor, Pomphis knew half a dozen ways in which life could be given to inanimate objects. With slow steps, Imaro made his way to the altar that held the bound form of Tanisha. He could feel the strength beginning to flow back into his limbs. The recuperative powers of the warriors of Ilyasai were as legendary as their prowess in war. Mercifully, the girl's swoon had lasted throughout Imaro's epic battle with the Azoth. Only now were her brown eyes beginning to open. She moaned as Imaro sliced through the leather thongs, then her eyes opened wide in bafflement. What she saw was a hazy apparition with the battered features of Imaro, atop a body in Mzungu armor, with a huge curved sword in its massive hand. It came as no wonder, then, that with a small cry, Tanisha promptly fainted again. Pomphis, who had followed Imaro over to the altar, let out a snort of disgust. "Now we'll have to carry her out of here. Curse the luck. Hurry, we haven't got all night." Imaro was about to retort when the sounds of the returning Mzungus rolled down the hallway and burst like a wave about them. "Too late!" cried Pomphis. Imaro agreed. "But we'll at least take many of them with us before we die." The first of the Mzungu horde pushed out of the darkness and into view. Many of them had armed themselves with long swords and wicked hooked knives. Imaro brandished his sword menacingly, daring the Mzungus to come forth and die upon its edge. Pomphis presented a defiant little figure, though inwardly he wished he weren't there. More of the Mzungus crowded into the chamber. When they saw their priest was dead and their god destroyed, their rage was terrible to behold. As one, they charged furiously across the chamber, clearly intending to tear the blacks into bloody pieces. Imaro watched the black skulls bobbing against the Mzungus' waists. He remembered that he would have to kill Tanisha before the Mzungus got to her. The skulls! At once the barbarian remembered what had happened when the priest had smashed Bomunu's skull. Then he remembered what he had seen in the carvings on the temple's outside wall. Imaro bounded over to where the priest's body lay. As Pomphis looked on in utter astonishment, the barbarian systematically smashed all of the skulls encircling his waist. Imaro paid no heed to the small explosions that accompanied each shattering, but the Mzungus did. Immediately the tenor of their shouting voices changed from fury to fright as 8 flame-eyed spectral wraiths arose from the remains of their prisons. Like the Nka of Bomunu, these wispy entities turned their lambast gaze upon Imaro. But he knew that he had nothing to fear from these. Indeed, these Nkas seemed to be expressing gratitude, for they were the last remnants of the people that the Mzungus had slain long ago, when they had first settled here. Somehow, the Atlantean priests had found a way to harness the life force, so that the Mzungus could live for centuries, aging only slowly. The Nkas of these ancient unfortunate people craved a vengeance more terrible than any that Imaro could ever conceive. The ghost things began to fall upon the terror-stricken Mzungus. As soon as the Incas were fully absorbed into a Mizungu, each host began a grotesque, frenzied kind of dance which ended in his tearing the skull from his waist and smashing it onto the stone floor, thus releasing more Incas. As the Incas sought out new bodies to inhabit, the Mizungus crashed against each other, attempting to flee in panic. Explosions rang throughout the chamber as more and more skulls were shattered, releasing more and more Incas. The Mizungus fled from the chamber like a herd of frightened deer. And they had good reason to be afraid. For each Mizungu that had been bereft of its dangling black skull, a pile of gray dust lay putrefying on the floor. Shrieks echoed down the dark hallway as the Mizungus fled their temple. "It isn't safe to remain here any longer," Pomphis said nervously. "These Incas don't want to harm us, but the release of so many of them has unleashed powerful mystic forces. We'd best not remain hereabouts." "All right," growled Imaro. He gathered up Tanisha, throwing her body across one strong shoulder. With Pomphis leading the way, they went out of the temple, up the ruined avenue, through the broken gate portal, and away from the dying city. Its long overdue destruction was imminent. Insane screams and thundering crashes of falling blocks of stone accompanied their flight from Miji-ya-Wazimu, the city of madness. It was not until they were far, far away that the barbarian and the Bambuti stopped running. Part 8. The End of It. The moon still shone brightly through the treetops as Imaro, Pomphis, and Tanisha rested quietly in a forest glade. A fire had been built to discourage the bolder predators. Tanisha had regained consciousness, but had sat staring empty-eyed, silent, until she screamed. Her sudden, piercing shriek must have startled the nocturnal prowlers as much as it did Pomphis and Imaro. Imaro's reaction was simple and direct. He reached out and struck Tanisha's face with an open-handed blow. Pomphis suspected that there was more to that slap than the mere quieting of an hysterical woman. However, he chose to maintain a discreet silence on the matter. Tanisha's response to Imaro's blow was instantaneous. It had removed her from the nightmare world of leering idols and pale madmen and deposited her quite firmly into the world of reality. She jumped to her feet and screeched, "Who do you think you're hitting, you big ape? Where are we, anyways? How did you get away from the Kakasa?" Imaro related the tale of his escape and his tracking of Bomunu into the unknown forest, and the events that followed. "The nature of your trail," he said darkly, "indicated that you did not resist Bomunu very strongly." "So that's it," thought Pomphis, as he listened in the background. Placing her hands firmly on her hips, Tanisha retorted, "He said he was going to kill me if I didn't go with him. Besides, I thought you were dead. I saw you fall after decimating half the Azanian army." "The women of my tribe," Imaro growled, "would kill themselves before allowing themselves to be taken by a man other than their own." "Do you know any who did?" Tanisha shot back, mockery showing on her piquant ebon face. Imaro thought for a moment, then he shook his head. Tanisha's face softened, and she walked into Imaro's arms, pressing her warm body close to his, burying her kinky-crowned head into his broad chest. Then she looked up at him and said, "Poor Imaro, strong enough to knock down an elephant, but with so much to learn about women." Imaro silenced her with a fierce kiss. Pomphis cleared his throat and interjected, "I suppose that I shall be standing the first watch." Pomphis was about to turn away to begin his watch when Imaro asked him a question that had been plaguing him for some time. "Just what was it you shouted to the Mizungus that drove them mad back there in the temple?" Pomphis grinned hugely. It's all quite simple. You see, the highest Mashetan in the Atlantean pantheon is named Mumwathu, so in their language I said Mumwathu eats draft dung. That was one of our ancestors' favorite battle cries during the Mzungu War. For the first time in many days, Imaro threw back his head and laughed long and loudly. The others joined him. The events of this night would haunt their memories for a long time to come, but for now they could send their laughter rolling up against the bright, sardonic moon. The end. As with every well-constructed story, we get hints which are later delivered on in surprising ways. The Black Skull's holding spirits is developed twice, first to bring out the Azoth, and second as a mechanism of revenge against superior numbers. So I appreciated this, but here metatextually is another element I wanted to draw your attention to. While I am by no means a hater of Robert E. Howard or of the pulp authors, in fact, I love their works tremendously, one thing that must be said about them is that they employed regrettable and stupid race science, stuff about degrading races and slippage back into less evolved forms, typically disparaging native peoples. Howard does this somewhat less frequently than Lovecraft does, but here Saunders demonstrates his knowledge of the form by doing the same and reversing it. It is the Mzungus who have de-evolved, who have lapsed from their once comely features. And this inversion gives us another layer of meaning beyond the immediate in the text and into a commentary on genre itself. Brilliant. All right, it's important that I shout out The Hills, who is the first of my YouTube subscribers to pick up Thrilling Suspense Fantasy. So be like The Hills, you regular listeners, and pick up Thrilling Suspense Fantasy, available via the links in the comments below. Also, up now at the Grunwald Contemporary Art Gallery in Bloomington, Indiana, is an exhibition of underwater Golden Age comic book covers owned by my fantastic friend Malcolm Mobutu Smith and curated by both of us, featuring original work by myself as well. If that were not enough to get you excited, let me tell you about Dream God, an exhibition opening at the Eiffel Gallery on March 3rd, featuring hundreds of my drawings and brilliant paintings by my friend Zach Koch. You gotta come check it out if you're in the Bloomington, Indiana area. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.